I am Suzanne LaGrande, today speaking with Ayser Salman, who is a writer, Emmy-nominated producer, and author of the book The Wrong End of the Table, a mostly comic memoir of a Muslim Arab American woman just trying to fit in. Welcome.
Thanks.
So to begin, could you just tell us a little bit about this book? It's a memoir, and just a little bit about what made you decide to write this book and tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
Mm-hmm. As the title suggests, it's basically a kind of pretty much comic memoir of an account of my growing up as an immigrant, as a Muslim immigrant in the United States. I was born in Iraq and I grew up in Kentucky. And I just didn't, as you can imagine, I didn't have anybody that was like me growing up. And it causes when you're trying to constantly try to fit in and look for the mirror or the ideal of what your quote unquote should be. And there's not, somebody who's exactly like you. You kind of, it sort of leads you to go into your mind and try to, you do a lot of analysis, self-analysis, as well as, therapy analysis. But the short answer to your question is that I wrote it because I thought, well, it's kind of been a lifetime of feeling like I was on my own island, and as much as I can be a chameleon and and sort of dip in and out of groups, and that's what we moved around a lot when I was younger, and I always joke that it's because it's what Arabs do, but it's kind of that. But also, my parents just moving from overseas to here to the States, and then from Ohio to Kentucky, and then within Kentucky, and then we went back overseas for mainly job opportunities, like most parents do, and perhaps most immigrant parents do. So what I was left with is this feeling of just kind of always being on the outside looking in. And, as I grew, and I always thought I would quote unquote outgrow it because, it's something, when you're young, you're always, there's kids are mean, or when you're a teenager, you're awkward and that kind of thing. And so, years later, I was still feeling that way. And I thought, well, you know what? There's something to that, and I wonder if I should write something, my own experiences that could help me kind of exorcise these demons or whatever you want to call them, and also potentially maybe somebody can connect with it, maybe somebody who has my experience, or maybe somebody who has an experience who may be similar to me, might connect to it, and so. It's kind of, I was looking backwards at at the young me, if there was like a young Ayser out there, who's kind of going through the same thing. I wanted her to know that, hey, here's someone else who has gone through it. And, I turned out all right. So, and I'm a writer, I write, I've been writing in the TV space and screenplay space. And I found that, most of my stories always revolved around, when you write, anything you write is going to be is based on your own experiences. But I found that they were literally based on them. And so I just kind of, thought I should put these experiences into blog form, and then that kind of morphed into essays, and then that morphed into this book. And fortunately, it came out. It was written and got the attention of my agent at the time when a lot of people's voices were coming. A lot of the quote unquote the other voices in America were coming out. It was 2016, and the landscape vastly changed. And so it was an opportunity for me to say, look, here's my voice, and it's not necessarily going to be your voice, but here's just a different way of, here's somebody else's experience. And it's been a really, really rewarding journey since the book has been out, and just even talking to people as I was writing it.
It's interesting that, you talk about the experiences of immigration, of cultural clash, of misunderstandings, trying to fit in, racism, xenophobia, and many of those experiences, I imagine, are somewhat painful. But you chose a comic touch. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Why are there things that you can say more effectively with humor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a comedy. Well, they always say you hide. Everybody that hides behind their true feelings behind comedy, it's kind of a defense mechanism. So there is truth to that, but it's also easier to get a message across, or a message sounds so serious, but it's just easier to. I find it easier to make. Well, it's twofold. So I think because I was always kind of wanting to fit in, and my superpower or whatever, as I was going, from school to school was my sense of humor and the ability to make people laugh. And so it started out being this defense mechanism. Okay, I'm going to kind of poke fun at myself so then you won't have to. And it kind of disarms people in the way of, like, especially back then when Iraq wasn't even a household name, and it's kind of like you're able to sorry, I just lost my train of thought. You might want to pull this up. Let me start over. You're able to connect with somebody easier when you make them laugh, I feel, than if it's more serious. And so it was kind of, I've always tended towards comedy, but I also felt like the reason I chose, to talk about a lot of these subjects, I think that's what you're referring to, that it's like, it's not this is a very serious book. I mean, there's obviously serious parts, but I think for me, it was the fact that it was, first and foremost, I wanted to entertain people. I wanted to tell them a story. And I just naturally find things funny. But also it was, I think, looking back at it, you kind of, again, going back to the whole, spending so much time in my head and analyzing things, I found that, I would kind of analyze them in a way where I'm thinking, okay, this seems really serious to me, but it's really not that serious when you compare it to X, Y, and Z. And, having a mother who was always like, it could be worse. You can be, people are starving and back in Iraq, and, what are you doing? You have McDonald's over here, and that kind of thing. That kind of always helped. It could always be worse. And so anytime I found myself going down this path of, victimhood or having a pity party or any of that kind of thing, I would always pull myself back and go, okay, well, where's the humor in this? And it wasn't a conscious thing I did. It just kind of, that was just the story, the narrative I told myself. And so it just made sense that when I was writing the book, that it would be told in that same way. And then, I mean, the reality also is that I didn't go through a lot of horrible things. I mean, that's the other part of the question maybe, is that when you think about a memoir, or when I would think about a memoir in the past, it was always somebody that had done something really serious, or had or important, or had overcome a serious addiction, or like Malala, getting shot while trying to go to school. And so for me, and now it's totally different. Now that I look, there's so many comedy type books that are kind of the same flavor. But when I was writing it, I was kind of nervous that I would come across as self-aggrandizing. And so I just, I thought, well, everything must be filtered through that narrative of comedy, because everything really is, if it's not life or death, then there is a way to find, the humor in it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question? I feel like also, and you probably notice this in the book, I meander, and so I I feel like I'm also doing this in this interview. So
No problem. It's interesting. You worked as a writer and a producer for major film companies, Universal, Miramax, Disney. How did you end up doing this? And also, what was it like being a Muslim Arab woman working in Hollywood? That must have been a whole other set of interesting stories to tell.
Right. You know what? It was. Well, first of all, so to answer your question, what I was doing and what I do as my day job is I'm a producer, a short form content producer and editor. And what that means is when it started back in when I fell into it back in early in 2000, it was the start of the DVD revolution. And so whenever a movie, there would be a movie made, there would always be marketing and there's the marketing aspect to get people to watch the movie, but also here's what happened behind the scenes, and you see that now all over the place. I mean, they call it content now. It's kind of a broad term for it, but it's basically anything that is related, like ancillary pieces that are related to the film or TV show that aren't the story of that aren't the show or the episode or the film. So, they're like promos and behind the scenes little featurettes and, little webisode kind of things. And it was really cool for me because I came, I was a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist when I was younger just because, like my parents, I mean, being Middle Eastern, it was, at the time it was two choices, well, you can go to med school, but if you want to go to be a journalist, we want you to make money. We don't want you to be starving, kind of thing. But it was around the time of Christian Amanpour, and so then suddenly being a journalist, had a lot of cachet. So I went down that path until I realized I don't want to report things. I want to create stories, and I want to tell, I want to go more in depth. And so I came out to film school. So then I always had the skill of being an editor, which is kind of the flip side of being a writer. It's the end of the line, basically. Like you're writing the story, you shoot it, and then you edit it, and you're rebuilding the story that way. So that's how that happened, and it was great for me because I was making these little movies, and we always joke writers always like want to be in a dark room and or actually in a room by ourselves writing, usually at a coffee shop. But being an editor, you really are in a room and you're just staring at images. And for an introvert type person like me, it was great. And you're creating and all of that. To answer your question of what it was like being a Muslim, it's interesting because I don't visibly present. So I think now the dialogue is a lot more, there's a lot more conversations around it. And that's why I'm loving talking about my book, is because there's so many different layers and it's not monolithic. But back then, my experience, and again, I only speak about my experience because everybody has a different experience, but my experience was that people had one view of what it meant to be a Muslim. And it was that you were, you covered up, and that you prayed 5 times a day, and that you didn't drink, and you didn't eat pork, and various other things. Not to get too specific about what the religion, what the rules and the pillars of the religion are, but most of the time it wasn't really something that came up. So and we're talking like minor little things like, there were the Jewish holidays, and then there are the Christian holidays, but the Muslim holidays didn't get, attention. And so it was I always felt kind of, not weird. Well, yeah, I guess weird would be the way about, trying to, say, hey, I have to take off for, early because it's Ramadan and I have to go for sundown, and you're working in a very intense, and this is another conversation too, because I was working for, companies like Miramax, and you have very intense deadlines, and people they want things when they want them. And so for you to be the one person that's like, I got to go, it's at the time, because there wasn't any other conversation like that, it wasn't it wasn't something that I really, I stood proudly for, I guess, is for lack of a better, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It's
Um,
interesting that some of those film companies that you mentioned, and I'm thinking particularly about older Disney films, were responsible for creating some of the cultural stereotypes of Arab Americans, as well as storylines that distort the lives of um, Arab Muslims abroad and here in the U.S. as well. So it's an interesting position that you are in to be kind of in the heart of that. And I think, would you say that those depictions are changing? And do you have any way of having a conversation about what those depictions are or what are being created now?
To answer your question, 100% they're changing. 100%, I should say, 1,000% they're changing by virtue of the fact that people with varying experiences are speaking up. So people like, me with my book, other people, that are coming forward. We're getting, I don't want to say, I hate when people say we weren't given the chance, but there wasn't really, because Hollywood is, and TV and film it's a business, and you want to make sure you have the audience, you want to make sure you have the eyeballs on your content, and so if it's out in society, if it's in the zeitgeist, if it's in pop culture, basically, if there's more people that we're seeing that are different religions or different experiences within the religion, it's going to show up on TV, and TV kind of is a little delayed. So we're seeing a lot of, like ever since 2016, we're seeing a lot more voices that are speaking out, which is great, and varying voices. And so it's natural that you're going to see that in stories that you see on television. I think, I've had so many conversations I've been on panels with other Muslim creatives, producers and filmmakers. And, I've noticed the conversation has gotten a lot happier, a lot more positive, a lot friendlier in the sense of what you see on TV, what you see on screen. Because I feel like in the past, on the one hand, yes, companies put on these, like you said, they have these characters depicted in a certain way, and it's kind of a caricature. But also that comes from only having, one type of voice in the creative process, not having the diversity. And so it kind of like, how are you going to get a well-rounded character if you only have a few people giving input, and so I can't really condemn things in the past. All I can say personally is that thank God it's getting better, that it, and also in a way, like when you have I always feel like when you have a group that's misunderstood, that sometimes what you see is the caricature at first, just because you want to. I'm not saying this is right, but I'm saying that you would see the caricature because it allows, or at least creatives, or at least the executives may think that people put things in a box, and they are only, like, for example, if somebody sees me maybe 20 years ago, they'd think, oh, well, wait, you're not, how are you Muslim? You don't, you don't wear a hijab, you don't have this, you don't tick X, Y, and Z boxes. So how are you that thing? And so it was, maybe easier back then to say, okay, well, here, let me present an exaggerated version of it. And again, I'm not saying it's right, but I kind of understand. Like I said, I told you I do a lot of analyzing. I kind of understand in retrospect why that was. Now, that should not be the case anymore because, again, we have, like I said, we have all of the input. We have the varying voices being able to weigh in on things. Where hopefully we have people in key positions in, like people in the writer's room and people in the executives, people on screen. And then we have a lot of groups, like I work with MPAC, which is, I do a lot of work with them, volunteer work. They're Muslim Public Affairs council, and they're just basically an organization that will go in, and if the network or studio has a story that has these characters that are Muslim characters or Middle Eastern characters, they will just basically run it through their filter and just say, okay, yeah, this is accurate. This is not. Maybe you should do this. And they don't. It's not like a gatekeeper or anything like that. It's just again, just having people in the community weigh in on, hey, is this accurate? And that's really all it comes down to. Again, long drawn out answer, but I think
it's interesting because there's also a question here about authenticity. There's a lot of versions of being an Arab woman living in the U.S., right? And I imagine that if you are one of the only voices, you are sometimes called upon to represent a whole group of people rather than just yourself. How do you how do you negotiate what it means to be authentic in this context?
I love that. That's a great question. Again, going back to a few years ago, there was a dialogue within the Muslim community of, is it my responsibility to teach you as a non-Muslim what I stand for? And there was this whole kind of, movement where a lot of people from the Muslim faith, from the community, were like, no, it's not my job. I'm just here existing. I was born in Bethesda or something like that, and my parents happened to immigrate, and here I am. It's not my responsibility to teach you. And I certainly understand that part. I personally feel like it is my responsibility to a certain extent. I think it's all of our responsibilities as human beings, because, and this brings into the authenticity question, is that we all have a different way of approaching things. I mean, it goes without saying, and I'm not saying we all stand in a in a circle and saying whatever, it's around the campfire, but it really is that when you distill it, it's that simple. It's just a matter of just being true to who you are. And so that I did not do when I was growing up. I mean, I look at these young women, I look at high school kids now, and I look at kids in their elementary school. They're so much braver than I was. And I'm talking about people both, Caucasian or, African-American or Middle Eastern. They're just, I feel like, I shouldn't, okay, let me strike that. Let me strike that last part. I can really only speak to people who are immigrants about the immigrant experience. I look at a lot of people who are immigrants now, who are young, who've newly immigrated. And I just feel like they're a lot more, they're braver, and they're more open to, put themselves out there for who they are. I did a lot of hiding. And, like I said, I grew up in Kentucky, and I wanted to have the bobbed hair, and I wished that my name was Mindy. I didn't like my name. I didn't like my exotic, whatever, my dark hair and all of that. I didn't like any of that. I didn't like when I was in school that people said that it looked like I had mascara on. And, now I'm looking back going, man, you always do that when it doesn't matter if you're an immigrant or not. You look back and you go, wow, I should have appreciated it more. So so authenticity is that. Authenticity is just everybody just saying, this is who I am. And, I'm loving all of the conversations right now. And that's another reason why I wrote this book, is because I'm by no means an expert on anything. This is just my story. And it doesn't really, like you said earlier, it's very comedic. And I think, a couple of, you're not supposed to read your reviews, but I read a couple of the reviews, and a couple of the ones that were not as stellar, they said that it didn't go deep enough, or they wanted it to go deeper. And I get that, because that's the thing. When you have these voices now, people want you to have this, serious, something that this dark kernel that you had overcome. And, my dark kernel is that I just didn't fit in, and I was trying to figure out where I fit in. But I really think that that's an important conversation to have, because I feel like there are so many of us that are just, we could stand to be a little more authentic. And before I go way off, you probably should step in, because I'm going to go on into a whole other thing.
Okay.
But am I answering? So your question was, yeah, I think I answered your question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So at some point you talked about, you said that everyone should write a memoir. Why?
Just getting back to that authenticity again. Exactly, for the reason that they tell you, creative, if you're trying to break creative block or whatever, to write in a journal. When, all of these various like meditation, guides and all these different books say that you should, journaling, how the importance of journaling is because you get it out there, and you realize there's stories that you don't know that you have until you write them down, really. This summer, I taught a workshop on basically that, why you should write your memoir. I was in Kentucky, and I had a really great group of people, about maybe 12 to 15, and I have to say all but maybe like 3 of them started their pitch, because we had to go around the room and explain. All of that, most of them said, well, I'm not really that interesting, but... And then they'd launch into the most fascinating story that I'd ever heard, and it's just, it's interesting, because that was exactly what I thought when I was writing my book. I thought, well, who cares? Who's going to care, really? And I think that for me, the humor, I thought that was my saving grace, because I thought, well, okay, I'll be funny at least. But what I found out the hard way, the first version of the book that went out, is that you can't, people aren't going to buy humor if it's not authentic. And, the first draft, I was lucky enough, my agent sent it out to a couple of publishers, and they came back with some, very, very helpful feedback. And I'm so glad that I'm so fortunate to have gotten it. But it was basically, the humor is getting in her way. And I realized I've got to dig deeper. And, if me as a writer, and I thought I was putting myself out there, wasn't even doing that to begin with. I had to go deeper. I think it's just a great way, if you're a writer. I think especially if you're a creative, if you're an actor, author, writer, even fiction, the more you get to know yourself, the more it informs your stories. I feel like when I was writing, when I'm writing television or screenplays, you can hide behind a character. I'm writing behind a person named, Summer or Sarah. It's not me. And so you can kind of pull punches a little bit, right? But when you're writing as yourself, you can't make up anything. You obviously you're hiding people. You're not using their real names and stuff, but still, like, somebody's going to come back. You cannot. It's too much of a web if you try to fictionalize something that should be fact, and it's inauthentic as well. So again, long drawn out answer, but this is why I think everybody should write their memoir. And by that I mean, like, you don't have to write a whole thing and publish it, but write it so that like, if you're writing, like, we're thinking now in terms of story, right? Everything is narrative. It's like, what is your story? What is your journey? And so it's such a great way to know yourself. And, I think even like in therapy, and some aspects are like, you create the story of yourself. It's such a great tool, that, yeah, I'm a big fan of it, because you find that when you start to write, and you really let yourself go, then you find these things in there that maybe you didn't know in a day-to-day, when you're like brushing your teeth and going to work, and you're coming back and everything's so regimented. You know what I mean? It just shakes your brain a little bit.
I've been talking today to Ayser Salman, who is the author of The Wrong End of the Table, a mostly comic memoir of a Muslim Arab American woman trying to fit in. I am Suzanne LaGrande, and this is Disobedient Femmes.
Get up, get up.